November 27th, 1095. In November 1095, the Pope Urban II held a speech at the Council of Clermont, calling for a war of liberation. The war was to be waged by volunteers who vowed to fight, by calling all Christians to war against the Muslims to defend the Byzantine Empire and potentially reclaim the Holy Land. He gave rise to the Crusades. During the church council at Piacenza in northern Italy in the first week of March that year, an ambassador of the Byzantine Emperor, Alexius I, asked for help against the Turks. Their advance across Asia Minor was increasing, and it had brought them within striking distance of Constantinople. The area we now refer to as the Middle East was a point of conflict for the Christians, who made pilgrimages to Jerusalem. However, the Seljuk Turks would now attack those making the arduous journey, and when the Turks took the Holy City, the Christians were barred from entering it. And now the Turks threatened to invade the Byzantine Empire and potentially take Constantinople. Therefore, Alexios and Urban II called upon the Crusaders to retake the lost Byzantine territory, to protect the Holy Land. It was not the first appeal of this kind, but for the Pope, it came at an important time. For quite some time, the papacy had been worried about the disintegration of Christendom's eastern frontier. The Pope's response upon hearing this news from the ambassador was not spontaneous. His predecessor, Pope Gregory VII, had already received the news of the Turkish penetration in 1074 and had proposed to personally lead a force of 50,000 volunteers to liberate the Eastern Christian brothers. He argued that with an army this big, they might even push onto the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. But it never came this far while Gregory was still Pope. The Schism of 1054 had divided Christendom into two separate branches, a Western Latin branch and an Eastern Greek one. From the beginning of his pontificate, Pope Urban II had been in touch with the Byzantine Emperor, with the aim of improving the relations between the Latin and Greek churches. The call for aid from the Byzantine Emperor provided an amazing opportunity for the Pope. While fighting to take back the Holy Land, he might even be able to quietly unite Christian Europe under papal control once more. The Pope called for the Council of Clermont in France and held his speech, in which he aimed to gain the necessary support for the expensive and extreme expedition. Once the Byzantine Empire was secure, the Christian lands were to be freed from Muslim control. He portrayed the Seljuk Turks as heretical, as barbaric savages, and as the enemies of the true followers of Christ. Many crimes were noted against the Christians in the East, all to inflame the Christians with anger and so that they would feel inspired to join the fight against the Muslims. Because this is what Christ had commanded, and so they obeyed. The enthusiastic crowd responded with cries of "Deus vult!" or "God wills it." There are 5 contemporary versions of Urban II's proclamation that exist, written by individuals years later after the success of the First Crusade had formed their attitudes and perspectives. Therefore, it is not clear exactly what he said. However, the message conveyed is clear. In his speech, he summoned the rich and the poor to embark on a righteous war. Just like his predecessor, he used the argument of the possibility of saving Jerusalem. Some versions mention Jerusalem as the ultimate goal, and some do not. Therefore, it isn't clear how important Jerusalem was as an objective to Urban. His letters suggested that it wasn't the ultimate goal, and this is backed up by Fulcher de Chalt, the most prominent source that we have from Clermont. Fulcher, who was an eyewitness present at the council, focused more on the message of freeing the Eastern churches in accordance with Byzantine wishes. The other sources place much more emphasis on capturing Jerusalem. Urban II would go on a preaching tour throughout France, and many priests and monks spread his message, including such figures as Peter the Hermit, who gained a large following of extremely pious peasants, and minor knights, who formed the first wave to go to the Holy Land, forming the Peasants' Crusade. Tens of thousands answered the call in 1096 and went on the First Crusade to find salvation while fighting for God. They took a vow and the sign of the cross, which defined the gesture of crusading. This was a textile cross that was sewn onto their clothes. Even though Urban II tried to persuade the old, women, monks, and the sick not to take the pilgrimage, it was impossible. The enthusiasm was so great that it was not just knights that answered the call, but great numbers of those incapable of combat and with no soldierly skill or intent. Those that answered the call, according to Urban II, would get a remission of their sins, or in other words, a ticket directly into heaven. Europe was violent with knights fighting each other, and Urban II had warned them that they could go to hell for this. The knights of Europe were well versed in violence, and indeed excelled at it. The European peace established under Charlemagne's empire had shattered, as his successors couldn't hold the different kingdoms together, and individual lords became more powerful. Managing to export the violence in Europe was appealing to Urban, as it would allow him to focus on reinstating papal primacy over all of Christendom. As well as this, soldiers were motivated by other factors. Some were motivated by the prospect of material riches and rewards in the land of milk and honey that Urban described. However, the risk was that the Crusaders had to sell their possessions and homes to raise the necessary money for the journey in the first place. Others were appalled by the tales of barbaric atrocities that the pagans had conducted. However, for most it was a personal piety that drove them to set out to free the Holy Land, and they were enticed by the prospect of the forgiveness of their sins. After 3 years of crusading, the Christians could celebrate as they took Jerusalem. The First Crusade was a success and led to the establishment of the 4 Crusader states: the County of Edessa, Principality of Antioch, Kingdom of Jerusalem, and the County of Tripoli. But before the news of the Christian victory could reach Europe, Pope Urban II had died.